So these next two sections are specifically, what we're going to do is we are going to move down the digestive system. We are going to start in the upper GI tract. We're going to take a look. We're going to basically take a piece of food. It can be whatever you want. It can be a BLT if we're thinking about eating that, or a salad or something like that. We're going to take food that we are ingesting. And we are going to travel and go all the way down the GI tract. So we're going to start, of course, with the upper GI tract. We're going to start with that oral cavity. And then we're going to make our way all the way down. And for this section, we are going to stop right there at the stomach. And that's going to consist of the upper GI tract. It's all the way from the oral cavity to the stomach. So looking at the different organs, and we will go through the specific functions here, but this is just going over the overall generalized functions. The oral cavity, which is going to include your salivary glands. This is where mechanical digestion begins. But we also have some chemical digestion that's happening here because of these salivary glands that are going to be secreting different substances as well. And we'll talk about what causes our salivary glands to secrete its substances. And what happens here in the in the oral cavity is going to be where we start that mixture of ingested food. And what it does is it forms something called a bolus. So I introduced bolus in the last section. I didn't really introduce it, I just said the word, and I said we'd talk about it later. So what a bolus of food is where we go in and we break down the food, and when we pack it, all of that food that we just broke down, we pack it together in a nice little ball of food before we put it down our pharynx to our esophagus. That's our bolus. So from there, it goes to the pharynx, to the esophagus, and then eventually to the stomach, where when we hit the stomach, we're going to break down that bolus of food, mix it with gastric secretions, and it is going to form something called chyme in the stomach. So let's start first with our oral cavity. As you can see, there's lots of different anatomical structures here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. We'll go through a couple of them that I kind of mentioned here and look at the functions of them, but as far as other ones, they're really going to be for lab. So a couple of them that I want, some of these are going to be obvious that I don't need to talk about, right? Lips. So I think everybody knows what lips are. But a couple that I want to introduce are these things called frenulum. So frenulum are going to be these thin little pieces of tissue that kind of stick out. You have several different frenuli. Is it frenuli? I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever had to say the plural word of frenulum. But you have several of these frenulums, I'm just going to say frenulums, in your mouth. You have one on the inferior portion of your lips right here. You have one on in the superior portion. It's very hard to talk whenever I pull my lips up right like that. And you probably can't even see it. I'm opening my mouth and trying to show you the frenulum, and you're like, I can't see it. I can't see what you're pointing at. And then you're going to have one, if you lift up your tongue, that big long one is called the lingual frenulum. So that lingual frenulum, it's actually super thick when we are born, and it's going to start to recede as we get older. It's actually thicker in fetal development, and then it thins out. Some people's doesn't, and they are going to be tongue-tied, and is going to be where they can't stick their tongue out very far. There's actually a name for it called ankyloglossia. I know it sounds like a dinosaur. Ankyloglossia. Anytime you see that word glossa, that means that has to do with the tongue, or lingual as well. But ankyloglossia is going to be where literally an individual is tongue-tied, to where that lingual frenulum is going to be, sometimes it's connected all the way to the tip of their tongue. So look up ankyloglossia, and there's a lot of pictures for it where the individual has the frenulum all the way to the tip of their tongue. But what happens is they can't stick out their tongue very far. You know, if you tell someone to stick out their tongue, But some people that do this, that's as far as they might be able to stick it out. It's because they have that lingual frenulum that didn't recede. And this can cause problems mainly with speech, and also with ingestion of food and breaking down materials, because we'll talk about how important the tongue is in breaking down and forming that bolus. We already talked about how important the tongue is in speech and the respiratory system. But that can easily be surgically repaired. They just go in and snip it. So a couple of other things. There is your hard palate, which most people are aware of, because when you were going through the bones in 2401, this might have been introduced there. This is going to help manipulate the food and form that bolus. If you think about whenever you chew up your food and you get it ready to swallow, a lot of times you push it up against, you take your tongue, push the food up against the hard palate. So right behind it is going to be the soft palate. And really the main difference between the hard and the soft palate is this is bone, and there's no bone back here that is going to be underneath it. And at the very end of the soft palate is that hangy down thing. You know what I'm talking about? If you open your mouth up and you have the little hangy down thing, that is your uvula. So there's a lot of different functions for the uvula. One of them is the gag reflex. If you've noticed, if you've ever gone through and tried to touch your uvula, you might have gagged a little bit. You might have even thrown up a little bit. So it's very important for a gag reflex. Some people are more sensitive than others. It just has to do with the sensitivity that you have there of your uvula. But another thing is that we'll talk about how when we go through this process of swallowing, that soft palate and the uvula are actually going to elevate and close off the nasal cavity. This is going to make sure that whenever we do ingest liquids or foods, that it goes down the pharynx and it doesn't go up into the nasal cavity. So you might have, whenever you were drinking water or milk or something once, or soda, and your friend tells a funny joke and you laugh right in the middle of it, and you have water or soda come out through your nose, it's because you have that kind of disruption of swallowing, and the uvula doesn't go and elevate like it needs to, and the water or soda can get up into your nasal cavity. That's why some people, if you've ever seen those videos of people that have spaghetti that goes through their mouth and through their nose, and they can do like this, it's because they can get it past that whole little structure right there. It's really gross. And then, of course, there is the tongue. We just introduced it with the lingual frenulum. But we know it's really important, and of course, we talked about speech, how important it is in speech. I just mentioned it. And we'll talk about swallowing. This is going to go in and manipulate and pack that bolus of food in, and it's going to actually push it to the back of our throat and move it down so it can move down. And it is going to ingest food, right? If you think about how when you lick ice cream, it helps bring food in, it manipulates, breaks down food. So lots of different things with that tongue. This is a better picture of what I was talking about with the hard palate and the soft palate. So this is showing that hard palate. There it is. There's the maxilla right there, and then the palatine bone, and then you are going to have that soft palate in the back, and there's that hanging down uvula right there. A lot of these things you are probably already familiar with, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So remember, the pharynx is shared with the respiratory system. And you can see how right here. So oropharynx is because that is going to be the one associated with the oral cavity. So when we swallow a bolus of food, there's my bolus of food right there. We are going to push it down that way. And it's going to go down the pharynx that way. So hopefully your food doesn't come into contact with that nasopharynx at all. So taking a look at the components, not the components, but the structure of the oral cavity, it's going to be formed of course, stratified squamous epithelium. Again, it has to do with protection. This is where we are ingesting different foods. So it could be potato chips that are potentially going to go in and, rip apart the tissue. So we need to have that really tough epithelial layer that's going to be there for protection. If you think about all the hot foods that we take in, pizza, if you've ever burned the roof of your mouth on pizza, or coffee, your tongue on coffee, then the reason why we have that stratified squamous epithelium is going to be for those. It's mostly keratinized, or sorry, mostly non-keratinized, but we do have portions that are keratinized, like the portions of the hard palate, portions of the tongue, and the lining of the lips. But underneath the tongue is non-keratinized, and it's underneath the tongue is really great for absorption of different drugs. Like if you are prone, if an individual has had a heart attack in the past, then they'll carry these little nitroglycerin pills, and then they pop them, if they feel chest pain, they pop them underneath their tongue, and it can be absorbed that way. Morphine is given, can be dripped under the tongue for very quick absorption.